Welcome to Crimepedia. I am your host, Morgan, and with me, as always, is my favorite true crime bestie. It's a lovely Cherry. Hello, Cherry. How are you?
Hello, I'm good, thank you. Very, very good, thank you. I'm very excited for this week's episode. It's our 100th episode. It's our second anniversary. I can't believe we've done 100 episodes.
I know. It just seems like yesterday we started this.
I know, it's crazy. So we've got some very, very special guests with us for this week. Your favorite person in the world and my favorite person in the world.
Yay.
So it's very exciting. So we've got Kacey from the Cult Vault with us. Hello, Kacey.
Hi, I'm very excited to be here. Thank you for letting me come along to celebrate your birthday.
Thank you for being here. And then we've also got the lovely Colin Sutton with us as well.
Hello, it's absolutely great to be with you. I'm really pleased. I thought it was meant to be a surprise for you, Cherry, actually, but
well,
sure.
yeah, it was.
It was.
It was supposed to be a surprise, but then he said, well, it's probably a good idea I tell you now, because otherwise you'll be really, really excited, and then you just be a bit excitable. So I've had time to get my excitement out the way, and so yeah, be a bit professional. So this week's case we're going to do is a bit different, isn't it? It's a bit different to normal. We usually do unsolved cases, cases that we might be able to help a little bit with, but seeing as we've got the godfather of true crime with us today, we are going to do one of his cases, which is from his new season, the second season of the Sky series, The Real Manhunter. So if you don't know Colin, where have you been? He is a former detective chief inspector and a senior investigating officer for the Metropolitan Police in London. So if you're from America, we always say on our show, we say we've got Colin Sutton, America has got Paul Holes. So that's the way we kind of explain to people who Colin Sutton is for America. He's our Paul Holes over here, which is yeah. Paul Holes is just over there. It was crazy walking around the Crime Con when we went to Crime Con. He had like security around him and no one could get near him. But then when he came to England, he was just there, cup of coffee, stood up chatting to everybody. It was so different. So
was there
different.
Bourbon in that coffee cup?
Yeah. He was the man that first raided the minibar during the great blackout at the hotel in London.
Oh, that was just the craziest weekend I think ever. It was mad. Yeah, it was really mad.
I should say actually that the case that we're going to talk about, it was one of mine in the sense I did it in Real Manhunter, but it wasn't one I investigated.
Yes,
it's one of the ones we're now doing that we're trying to use the same techniques and the same principles, but talk only to people who are actually involved. But their cases, and it opens it up for us to go throughout the country and to deal with some really sort of interesting cases as well. So we're going to do a third series that's going to be all like that.
Yeah, I mean, when we were looking at what we wanted to talk to you about, obviously everybody knows you from the Levi Belfield case and also the Delroy Grant case. Both of your books, you've got two books out, The Night Stalker, obviously Delroy Grant, and then Manhunt, How I Brought Serial Killer Levi Belfield to Justice. And so we thought, well, because always everybody talks to you about those ones, we thought it might be quite nice that you might be able to talk about something a bit different for a change, because you always get questions about that one. And the one that we picked was one that was it was a bit of a shocking one because Morgan managed to get the Real Manhunter to watch over there, and it's quite a shocking one, this one, because the offender is so young, and for such a violent crime, and for it to be such a young child, really, and that's why we wanted to pick this one. And this one, if you have got Sky, you can watch this. It's in the second season, and you can watch the whole episode about it where Colin talks, and also the detectives that were on the case also talk about it as well. So it's a really interesting one.
I think it goes on Acorn, or it may not be there yet, but it will be on Acorn in the US. Yeah.
Season 1 is currently on, and it should be season 2 coming up hopefully soon.
Excellent. And we've got season 3 on its way, did you say? Got another one on its way?
Yeah, we've just literally got the email saying, oh, yes, we'd like another one, please. So when we're going to do it, I don't think we'll start filming it now until the start of next year. So it'll probably be next summer before it's out. But yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so the case that we're going to talk about today is the case of James Attfield and Nahid Almanea. And on the 29th of March 2014, James Attfield was 33. He was known to some of his friends as Jim, and he had had a car accident in which he had sustained some brain injury when he was a bit younger. And this made him very vulnerable. He was a very vulnerable person. It gave him a lot of challenges in the fact that there was lots of things that he would do that weren't particularly normal. He would drink in his local pub every evening, but he had children and he was well liked by a lot of people. A quiet guy who was pretty much harmless, really. It didn't seem to be there was very many people that had anything bad to say about him at all. And on the 28th of March 2014, James had left his local pub that he was drinking in and walked through this area called Castle Park in Colchester in Essex. And I was funny because I looked into Castle Park, and it actually does have a castle in it as well. So there's this castle at the top of like a hill, and then so there's a park. It's a quite big park area, and then there's a river and there's a lake that is in this park as well. So it's got a massive area, and he was seen by a witness laying down in the grass. So obviously he's had a few drinks in the pub, and he's gone through this park for whatever reason, and has laid down in this park in the grass, and there's quite good CCTV in this area. So police were able to look on the CCTV. And at 5:45 in the morning, the next morning, James was found on the towpath by the river. And he had been stabbed 102 times. This is a horrific, a horrific attack on this guy. And he was actually alive when he was found.
So real quick, where he was seen lying on the grass, that's not where he was found after he was stabbed.
No.
Is that correct?
No, that's right.
Okay. And real quick, what kind of area is this in Colchester?
I can tell you a little about it. It's I mean, Colchester itself is obviously a very, I think it's England's oldest town, and it's a military town as well. There've been over the years barracks there, and so the town centre is quite busy, but it's actually essentially a kind of suburban town or city. It might even be a small city, is it? I don't know. And where this Castle Park is, it's got lakes in it, it's got a river through it, it's got housing, kind of modern housing towards the edge of it as well. And then on one side of it there's like a shopping area and a cinema and a bowling alley or something like that. So it's pretty kind of, when I went down there when we were filming for it, and I was quite surprised at how busy it was. It's not, it looks, if you look just at the pictures, it looks pretty rural and like it would be pretty quiet, but it's actually not. It's actually very well used because you've got this housing nearby and all these other sort of attractions nearby to it.
But so it sounds like to me, this is not a type of area where you'd expect to find violent crime.
No.
To this extent. Okay.
No.
Not at all. Not a lot. No.
I mean, I think they had more like, I think they were like more like normal stuff like drug activity and stuff like that, but nothing horrendous like, you know, somebody being stabbed like to that sort of capacity. So when he was found, he was still alive. Unfortunately, he did pass away at the scene. And the police started their preliminary investigations and found out that at 1 a.m. that morning, a passerby had seen him in the park and had asked him, like, you know, are you okay? And he said, yes, I'm fine. So we know that he was okay and everything was all right at 1 o'clock. And then obviously he was found at 5:45. So that gives us this window of like 4 3/4 hours or whatever for when this could have happened. So it appeared that there was no motive for this. I mean, he was well liked. He had a good family. He had a good support system. He didn't seem to have any enemies at all. And it's obviously being stabbed that many times is quite a savage, horrific attack. And the police sort of didn't have anything at the time to go on for any reason why this would have happened. Like you said, it's not the sort of place that you would expect this kind of thing to happen. So the police sent out e-fits and released parts of the CCTV out to the public, and also Crime Watch did a segment on their show about it, and then did another segment as well to try and keep it sort of in the public's mind because it's a pretty savage attack. There was nothing came of the tips that came into the police, and there was a few leads that were generated and a few arrests that were made, but nothing really actually happened at the time. So Colin, when you have something like this where it just seems to be like a complete random attack, what's the police's sort of first port of call? What do you do when something like this comes in?
Well, they do a number of sort of things you do in parallel, and I mean, as you say, you know, these days, of course, CCTV is always the thing, but if you're in the middle of a park, you're probably not going to have it there and then, but you have it on the outskirts. So that was done. you have to enlist, even, when we were in the Met and we had quite a lot of officers and quite a concentration of people and of CCTV, it was still difficult enough, and you have to enlist the eyes and ears of the public. If you transplant that out into a county, into Essex, where you've got far fewer inhabitants, but also far fewer police officers as well. I think one of the things that impressed me with the investigation here is that the good use that they did make of local media outlets and publicity and press appeals and media appeals. And you'd also look at, you mentioned there, Jerry, that there was some arrests made. You do also look at the kind of, round up the usual suspects. No, I don't mean that, but you kind of look at who in the area, have you got people who live nearby, who are not in prison, who are out, who have been convicted of knife crime, of serious assaults, that's often where those sort of initial arrests will come from, where you find somebody like that who you can't eliminate, and they can't eliminate themselves because they don't have an alibi or they weren't somewhere else, and so that happens there. So yeah, I mean, it's these. I always say this. The reason that the detection rate is so good for murder is because most murders are committed by people who are known to the victim and who aren't thinking about how they might get caught when they commit the murder. And so if you throw enough resources at it, which fortunately we still do and are still able to, then with lots of police officers, lots of forensic scientific work, you will solve it. It's that small percentage, and it might only be 2, 3, 4% at the edge of murders that are premeditated and where there's absolutely no connection between the assailant and the victim, and where you've got nothing else, like in this case, because there's no CCTV and there aren't the eyewitnesses. They're the tough ones. They're the really difficult ones. They're the ones that you when you're taking the one, you take a gulp and think this is gonna be tough.
Well, I mean, we had 3 months after this happened, so that sort of case there was nothing really very much going on with it for the police, and 3 months later in June at the Sallery Brook Nature Reserve. Now this is like a trail, Morgan. This is a bit like, like the Appalachian Trail that we talked about. This is kind of but on a much, much smaller scale.
Okay.
This is a nature reserve also in Colchester. And there was a 31-year-old Saudi Arabian girl called Nahid Almanea, and she was on her way to college at the University of Essex, where she was a student. Now, she was, again, a very gentle, kind person. She had no known enemies, and she was walking along Sallery Brook, which is an isolated footpath. So it's kind of, I don't think when I was looking at the pictures of it, it's not really overgrown, but it's one of those places that I probably wouldn't want to walk down by myself. But a lot of people did walk along that area, and her body was found at 10:30 in the morning, and she had been stabbed 16 times. Obviously not as many as James, but equally as horrific, and obviously it was fatal, and unfortunately she lost her life as well. Now, again, looking at the similarities between the two scenes, this is another huge scene. There's a lot of people using the area. There was a university to one side. There was a housing estate nearby as well. And so there is clear similarities between the two murders, but there were also some huge differences between the murders. Obviously, you've got one male, one female. One has got horrific, lots of stab wounds. The other one's got a lot less stab wounds. And it happened at a different time of day. One was early hours of the morning. The other one was like 10:30 in the morning she was found. And so when you look at things like this, people are then starting to worry that there's a serial killer on the loose. And because this is covered in the news, and it was all over the news, and police are advising people to think about where they travel and don't travel alone and that kind of stuff, but trying not to create some sort of hysteria, which it kind of does. So when you have cases like this, Colin, what kind of problems does this give the police when you've got now got 2 murders in an area that doesn't usually have murders? What kind of problems does this give you?
I mean, there's a number of issues. First, you've got that balance between using and having to use the general public as your eyes and ears and trying to get information from them, and not making them frightened to go out, not saying, not imposing a curfew almost by overstressing the danger. you've also got a very kind of technical difficulty for the investigators, and that is that when you hear about linked offences, and you will only really formally link an offence if you've got either DNA or a fingerprint that proves that the assailant was the same person. Because technically, the way the database works, if you link them, somebody who's eliminated from one has to be eliminated from the other. And if they're not linked and you do that, you risk losing your proper suspect. So unless you've got that, and they didn't have that at first, you've then got this issue. And we had it with Belfield, and the way we dealt with it was by inventing this thing we called a linked investigative series, which was something we made up. But what we essentially were saying was that these two crimes are so similar and in such a similar area and such a similar method that we think it makes perfect sense for the same team to investigate them both. But we're not saying that they're linked. And of course, by saying that, you kind of then hype up the media thing even more, because, oh, look, there's a serial killer on the loose, and all of a sudden it sounds worse. But, as I said, I talked about before, there's a reality of living this dramatic sort of device of, oh God, when's he going to strike again? And these officers had that there. They'd had the first one, which was horrific. They had the second one, which was equally horrific. And yes, there were differences between them, but they're thinking, well, this is Colchester. This sort of thing doesn't happen. It doesn't happen once, let alone twice. So, it really feels for them. And Essex Police are a provincial police force. They've got, an eighth of the numbers, a tenth of the numbers of the Met to deal with. And this turned into one of their biggest, if not their biggest ever investigation.
With the second victim, was it ever considered to be related to race in any way, with her being Saudi Arabian?
I don't think it was, but there was a sensitivity around that, and
Right.
I know myself, when you're dealing with victims from foreign countries, then you have to make sure that the liaison with those countries are correct and done. It does add another dimension of difficulty. I think it was the fact that she was obviously a Muslim lady that had been murdered was something which the officers had to have in mind and bear in mind, that could be part of the motive. And therefore, you then open up another can of worms in some ways, as looking at who might have done it and what their reasoning might have been. And then that takes you away from the first murder, because they're so different. And it's really, really tough job for them.
And obviously there wasn't any concrete evidence either on either of the crime scenes that it was a particular person. There was some DNA found on the second murder. There was some DNA found, so they did at least have some DNA that they could then use. The police looked to see if there were any offenders that lived in the Colchester area that had the same MO as this offender. Like Colin said earlier, they basically went out and looked at anybody that had anything in their sort of arrest history where it was violent crime, knife crime, anybody that wasn't in prison at the time, anybody that was out. And this ended up with them having 70 people who were then called in to be interviewed on suspicion, for this. So, 70, that's crazy. That's a lot of people to have in. This led them to a 15-year-old boy, and he is a boy. I'm not going to call him a man because he's a boy. He's 15 years old, and he's a guy called James Fairweather. Now, he had been convicted of knife point robbery in a shop in January of that year. And so he then was brought in. He was interviewed, and he denied having any involvement in these murders. He was at home at the time, didn't have anything to do with them.
So basically, if I'm getting this right, of these 70 people, they looked at people that had committed crimes with knives. Is that how I'm hearing that?
Yeah.
So
people that had the same. Yeah.
So
I think that they might. They may not all have been convicted of crimes with knives. I think there would be. You'd look at intelligence reports as well of people carrying knives and possibly using. But yeah, essentially that people with links to knives, should we say?
I want to go back real quick. With the lack of DNA as a police officer, does that indicate to you that this was not this was an attack that surprised the victim, and possibly not involving someone that she would have known. So it's not a domestic violence situation where I would see if it was a familiar attack, if it was domestic violence, you would assume that there would be some physical aspect to it which would allow DNA to be on the victim. But in this case, there's no DNA. Does that tell you that this was something that came out of the blue?
Yeah, it's what we sometimes refer to as blitz attacks. Really, that it is possible. It's more difficult with a stabbing than it is with a blunt instrument attack a la Belfield, because stabbing, you've got the chance of kind of cross contamination of blood and so forth, more so than with a blunt instrument attack. But yeah, I mean, if you've got a typical kind of a fight, if you like, where the parties are known to each other in some way, then the chances are that there's been some kind of cross DNA touching beforehand that might turn up. Okay. If you've got absolutely nothing at all, it's more likely to be a blitz attack. Yeah.
Okay.
And also, like an attack like that with a knife, I mean, that's usually like a pretty personal attack. It's somebody, you having to get up really close to somebody to be able to use a knife on them. So it's quite a savage attack on somebody. I mean, if you're fighting and the person sort of is aware that you're coming at them, it's a bit different to if they're just surprised like this. And a knife is a pretty savage way of doing that. And I'm surprised that there wasn't more DNA, because quite often they cut themselves, don't they, in instances like that. And so you're quite likely to get a DNA profile from something like that. But obviously this was a really long, slow investigation, because there wasn't really anything that the police had to go on. They did do a media campaign asking the public, again, like Colin said, getting out and asking the public for help. There was a witness that said that they saw a man on the nature reserve the morning that Nahid was killed, and he was wearing this like I always think it sounds like a donkey jacket, but it's like a leather distinctive leather Italian jacket, and it's like trying to describe what kind of thing it looked like. It was like sandy color, almost like a sandy color jacket, but it was very distinctive. And I love in the actual episode, I love the analogy that your investigation is like a pyramid. And I think this was one of the detectives that was on the case said, he said, basically you have to close off every line of inquiry as you go up this pyramid, and you just narrow it down until you get to the top. And that's the person, because that's the last resort that you've got. And I love the way he described it like that, because that's a really good way of looking at it.
Yeah.
There was so many lines of inquiry for this. And they even had some officials that came over from Saudi Arabia to discuss the case with Essex Police as well. So even they got involved in this. And something else that was pointed out in the episode was that it was such a huge operation that money is also a factor. It costs a lot of money to run an investigation like this. And obviously it shouldn't come down to money, should it? But realistically, it does have to, because it does cost money to do it.
Yeah, it does, and perhaps having had the the sort of luxury of doing most of my major crime investigation in the Met, it never really was too much of a problem. We had a budget. I had a budget I had to stick to, but you could normally find some more money if you needed kind of scientific work done that was going to be expensive. Then it could be found, and I think that's still the case. Most forces have contingency funds and things, and something like this is not going to be written off for the sake of spending money. Where it does come in is again the poor old SIO's there, and that's his or her problem. And if you end up spending thousands or hundreds of thousands of pounds on something which doesn't work essentially, and someone might be asking you questions at the end of it, and that's a worry. But I think even these days people can still be relatively confident that if there's a murder, then something needs doing, it gets done.
That's good. That's really good. It's nice to know that, isn't it? So this case carried on, and so it wasn't until the following year, and it was on the 26th of May 2015, the police finally got a breakthrough in the case, and a woman was walking along the Salary Brook Trail, and she saw this young guy acting a bit strangely by the bridge that's there. He then hid in the bushes. So straight away she's thinking, this is a bit weird. Like, what's he doing? And this is very close to the area where Nahid was killed. Now, he was wearing a very similar Italian-style leather jacket, similar to one that the victims and the people the witnesses had reported seeing him wearing the morning of Nahid's murder. So this woman got really spooked by this guy and turned around and went back the other way and met a friend who was walking her dog. So they went down together to see if he was still there, and he was. So they phoned police, and luckily there was a local police officer who was literally 3 minutes away from where they were. He went straight down there, talked to this guy, and this asked him if he had anything on him, and he did. He had a knife on him, and he had a pair of rubber grip lock gloves. So obviously not the sort of thing you usually carry around. It's a bit suspicious with that kind of thing. And so they arrested him on the spot. They took him into custody. And that man was James Fairweather, the 15-year-old boy that we were talking about earlier. Now,
well, sorry, Cherry, what time of the day was this where he was hiding in the bushes?
This was in the morning. I believe she was walking through that area. So this is like broad daylight.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, it's a bit crazy, isn't it? And so obviously he's acting really
I think
strangely.
that's just an interesting detail. Yeah, just kind of really. Oh, okay.
But just waiting there. He's just waiting there in the bushes. And then that makes you kind of think, okay, well, what was he waiting there for? Because at this moment, she doesn't know who he is. She doesn't know where he's from. The police don't know who he is. They don't know where he's from either when they get there to speak to him. But obviously what he's carrying isn't normal. And so they arrest him, take him into custody. Now, as soon as he was in custody, he started admitting to these murders. And his interrogation video, when I watched it, is quite chilling because he literally just talks about it matter of factly, just like we're chatting. He talks about it just like it's a normal thing, and he explains exactly how he carried out both of the murders. He even stood up at one point and is demonstrating what he did. But you've got to remember, in all of this, he's a 15-year-old child, so he's actually, in the terms of law, he's a child. So what I was going to ask you, Colin, when you have something like this, I mean, obviously these is horrific crimes, not just one, but we've got two. When you've got a child involved, what problems does that bring you then?
Yeah, it means that you have to have somebody, an adult, an appropriate adult by law, there with them while they're being questioned, while they're being, if they have any sort of intimate samples taken, things like that. But, police officers are used to that because for lesser crimes, it's the same. The fact that it's murder makes it no different. It's the same.
Right.
There's a skill certainly to interviewing generally that would cause issues with. You have to pick the right people to do the interviewing. That wasn't really an issue in this case because James Fairweather just, the thing that upset him, I think, was that he'd been stopped before he could kill more, not that he'd been caught. He almost wanted to be caught. It was part of the... I don't know, part of what he had embarked upon, part of how he wanted to make a name for himself was to be this serial killer. And he'd been stopped after only two. It's interesting, isn't it? I don't want to get too sort of political with a small p but there's a lot of stuff around saying, should young people, legal children be searched? Should they be tasered? Should they be, and the fact is that a 15-year-old with a knife is just as dangerous as a 25-year-old with a knife.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
There's no kind of way of telling it. I do say to people, the worst, thankfully, I wasn't assaulted very much while I was on duty in 30 years, but the worst assault.
Very much.
No, well, but a lot of people get it a lot worse than me, they put it that way. But the worst assault I did suffer was from a 14-year-old girl. So,
Oh, girl as well.
She was actually handcuffed at the time, but anyway, she used her feet. We won't go into it as to where they landed, but it was very painful. But that's so it's you can't make these kind of blanket decisions saying he's a 15-year-old, therefore he can't be capable of the utmost evil because he is a 15-year-old that was, and when you've got a knife stuck in you, you don't really care whether the other end of it's held by a 15-year-old or a 50-year-old, do you?
No, that's right. And also, when you look at teenagers. I mean, I'm not the tallest of people, so obviously most people are taller than me, but I've got a teenage daughter, and a lot of her friends, they're big strapping lads. And I think, you know, a man would have trouble, you know, dealing with, especially in a situation where they're manic or they're angry. I think it's, you know, some of them are as big as fully grown men. So I don't think it matters so much like that for age.
So he was 15 at the time of the arrest, right? So he was 14 at the first murder?
No, he's 15 at the time of the murders. He was 15 at the time of the murders.
And he was 16 at the time of arrest?
Yeah. No, it was a year later, but I don't know when his birthday was. So I believe he was still 15 when he was arrested.
Okay.
So strange that those two crimes happened so close together, and then there was that, you know, if it was always his intention to carry out more of these crimes in the way that you've mentioned, Colin, to kind of create a name for himself, it's so strange that there was that period of time where he was inactive, I suppose you might use that terminology.
Yeah. And there's no I don't know the answer to that. You know,
school exams maybe, or something like
that.
Well,
you don't know. That's right. I mean, he did have a point there was something in his life. I think one of his grandparents died. I think his grandma died at some point, and that was something that was said to have had a big impact on him. But the other thing that you'll be interested to know, Kacey, is that he was absolutely obsessed with serial killers. And he had, you know, people say, oh, my favorite which is, I think is bizarre, but my favorite serial killer is this guy. His favorite serial killer was Ted Bundy. He was a massive fan of Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, and he'd been researching online when they went through his online records. He'd been searching serial killers, how they carried out their crimes, how they would get their sentences reduced, what to say in court. So I mean, this is something that this boy had been really, really interested in, to the point where it was obsessive. And he tried to, when he went to court, he attended Guildford Court and was charged with murder, but tried to appeal it, saying that he admits manslaughter on the ground of diminished responsibility, because he was hearing voices in his head, which is of course exactly what Peter Sutcliffe tried to do and failed, thankfully. And he was then researching online ways that if he was to be arrested, how could he get his crimes reduced? How could he get his sentence reduced? By going to court. He was ultimately found guilty and was convicted of both murders, and was detained on a life sentence with a minimum term of 27 years. So, I mean, he's 15. So 27 years later, I straight away thought, well, hang on, he's not going to be that, you know, he's going to be like 40 something by the time he comes out. But when I was reading into it a bit more, it was like he probably won't ever come out. It was just that it would be because he's a child, he can't be given a full life term. I think that's a bit crazy.
Well, I think that's, you know, where we've talked about how children, you may have thought I've said children shouldn't be treated any differently. I don't think children should be treated differently in an active, dynamic situation, if you like. They present just the same threat as an adult would do.
Yeah.
I think there are questions we can certainly ask ourselves as a society. How do children get to that position? How did that individual child get to that position? And when it comes to the sentencing, you know, it's the same with every life sentence. There is a recommendation made, which is the minimum time to be served before an application for parole can be made. And I think the way, or the potential for a change between a person who's 15 to 42, as he would be in this case, is huge.
Yeah.
Whereas somebody over 27 years who's already an adult and has already formed, you know, their adult sort of way of thinking and whatever, perhaps it's less easy to imagine that there'd be real progress and real rehabilitation. So I guess I don't have too much of a problem with that, as long as the structures around it and the processes around it at that time, 27 years hence, are such that the right decision is made. I think to give a child an opportunity to mature and grow and learn a lesson is perhaps something we ought to be comfortable with.
Now, with him being a child and this happening, if he does get released in 27 years or whenever, would he be eligible to receive the same protection that someone like John Venables received when he was released?
Well, that's a good question. My sense is to say no, because he's not had that protection so far. But I don't know.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. Did they release his full name in the media and everything? Because usually with children that wouldn't. Wow. Okay. So of course, then what you're saying about the protection of identity and the naming of the minors and things. Wow, that's a really interesting point.
What you should also bear in mind as well is that anybody who is released from a life sentence on parole after whatever time that they've served is always on license for the rest of their life. And
okay.
they
Wow.
can be recalled, not even for a conviction. They can be recalled, if they're living their life in a way which is incompatible with the terms of that license. But certainly any conviction from any crime makes them liable to be recalled to prison at any time. So there is that kind of backstop for it as well.
Isn't that stranger when you look at the James Bolger case and you look at what those two lads did to Jamie Bolger, and then you look at this case where this guy is equally as horrific, and there's two victims. The fact that the two lads got anonymity and got let out and they were given new identities, but then this guy, that is totally different, and that he was named in the in the press, and then he'll be let out on license, but he's still hasn't got that anonymity that they were given, and he was a child the same.
It's a very good point.
Funny how that's worked. Yeah, it's funny how that's worked like that.
I'll confess, it's a point I never thought of while we were making the film on this program. It never occurred to me, why do we know his name? But you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? Well, I mean, when you watch the episode, it's quite unlikely he would be on the streets again. But obviously, like Colin said, if he goes through, I mean, we've spoken with our friend Dr. Das about rehabilitation. We talked about like Charles Bronson and the fact that he's coming up for possible release, and the fact that most people will be like, what? But when you actually look into the crimes that Charles Bronson did, they're actually not as horrific as some other people that they're coming up for release, and he's been in prison for all this time. When you actually look into it and speaking to our friend Shahom, the rehabilitation question always comes up. Can somebody who's committed a violent crime like this, not once but twice, can they be rehabilitated as going in as a 15-year-old? By the time they're 40 something, can they be rehabilitated onto the right path? And that's a huge discussion that you have that a lot in the true crime circles. Is it a rehabilitation in prison, or are they going to come out and the public are worried that he's going to do it again? It's a very tough one, I think, that one.
I have to say, it's a question that I'm really glad I never had to put my mind to. That's all.
Yeah.
After we do our job, somebody else has to decide that, thankfully, because I think it's there are so many competing things that you can think of and competing ideas, and I don't actually know what I think, generally, let alone an individual case. So
yeah, I agree with you. I'm really on the fence on that one. I'm not actually sure, because obviously when you look at the James Bolger case, one of the two offenders has towed the line and has been very good since, but the other one has been in trouble a lot and been back to prison and then let out again and then been in trouble again. But so with that case, one has actually reformed and sorted his life out, but the other one not so much. And it's going to be an individual case thing. I think you'd have to look at it individually.
I think the important thing for the public in all that is to have transparency as to the decision making. We've seen some parole decisions over the last few years. Primarily, I would suppose Colin Pitchfork, who was released
oh my God,
reoffended and was taken back or lived his life in the wrong way and was taken back as well. And then also John Warboys, of course, who was going to be released, but we managed to get around that. And you can never trust what politicians say, can you? But there seems to be moves afoot to make that process more open and more challengeable, I suppose, because I think up until pretty recently, the parole board's been pretty much aligned to itself and has made its decisions, and there's no way of kind of really looking behind those or really challenging them, and that's the place where we are now.
That's a job I wouldn't like. I wouldn't like to be on a parole board. I don't think I'd like that responsibility.
They probably wouldn't want me on it anyway.
I suppose as well, there's that whole discussion around somebody at 15 who's at a vulnerable stage of brain development, you know, and you would hope that their brain would develop in a positive way going forward, Colin, as you've mentioned, to the point where they're eligible for release, or at least considered to be eligible for release. But then if you're surrounded by a certain type of person within the judicial system, within the penal system, you know, who's to say that somebody wouldn't have been rehabilitated or reformed in a certain way if they weren't around certain individuals? So it really is kind of like that impossible circle, and there's so much to consider.
Yeah. Can we be certain that our prison system actually is the right place to rehabilitate and to make that change on a 15-year-old's brain?
Yeah,
I wouldn't like to say, but I'd have my doubts. I have to, you know, my senses to doubt it.
Yeah, it's crazy. So many questions.
Now, Colin, when you reviewed James Fairweather's interview and his confessions, was there anything that you were able to pull from that could explain his mindset or who he was as a person, at least at that time? Was it something, or were there things that you noticed that you could point to, any other offender that you said, you know what, that really sounds like this person that we had interviewed?
No, not the latter. Not anybody that I personally came across, because the people, you know, I guess I dealt with two murderers who killed more than one person on different occasions, and both of those, well, one of them was Belfield, who refused to talk to us anyway, and still says he didn't do anything, and the other one was so completely unwell, mentally unwell, that there wasn't any hope really of getting anything sensible or telling out of him. When I saw James Fairweather's, I just kind of, you know, I think I said it earlier, it just seemed to me that this was somebody who was so matter of fact, who really thought he was just going through a part of the process that he expected, and that he'd kind of maybe even rehearsed in his mind. You know, this is how it's going to go. And that, you know, the disappointment was not that he'd been caught, but they'd been caught so quickly before he could kill some more.
Yeah.
Because he had like 15 in mind, didn't he? It was 15 people he had in mind.
Yeah,
that he wanted
to beat Sutcliffe. He thought Sutcliffe was his kind of hero, his favourite serial killer, as you put it, and he planned to beat him. Yeah, you know, and it's a really, I mean, there's just so many kind of philosophical questions on this, because somebody who thinks like that is clearly not normal. So, you know, they're clearly not well, are they? You know? No. So then you sort of say, well, okay, if they're not normal and they're not well, then should we actually hold them to the same standard as somebody who is normal? You just get into this sort of philosophical question, which is why I was quite glad to really be dealing with families and with evidence and forensics, and leave all that sort of thinking about the why. And people, it's interesting, it's probably shocked some of the sort of true crime people. I've said many times before, I'm rarely concerned about motive. Actually, most of the murders that I've investigated, the why wasn't relevant. We needed to find out the how, and the when, and the who. And sometimes if you've got nothing else, then going to the why might be able to point you in the direction of the who. But if you can get the who and the how some other way, the why
doesn't really matter, I suppose. Yeah. Well, I mean, the police looked into Fairweather's background, obviously into his home life, and it was that he didn't really have a bad home life. I mean, at school, he had told people he wanted to be a serial killer, and that was obviously very odd. But he was bullied at school because he had quite big ears, so he was bullied at school. But his home life was fine. It wasn't as if he came from the background of something where, you know, it was always in trouble. He wasn't really in trouble very often. And his family didn't report him hearing any voices or having any mental issues, because obviously somebody who does hear voices and stuff, it doesn't just click like that and there they are, all of a sudden they're hearing these voices. It's a matter of lots of different things lead up to this, and before they get more and more unwell. But with him, he had researched online what's going to get me my sentence reduced, and then all of a sudden he's like, oh no, but I'm hearing voices, they're telling me to do it. And it's
Yeah.
almost like Colin said, like he's rehearsed this. He knew eventually he'd be arrested. And it's like this is a matter in the process of me killing all these people. I'm going to get arrested at one point. This is what I'm going to say. And I think that's quite, you know, he's obviously done a lot of preparation for that. And for a 15-year-old, that's crazy.
I'm interested to know because with Colin, he said that he was very matter of fact in his interview. I really wonder if he's on the spectrum at all, because it does seem
I think
like
he was. Yeah, I think he was actually. They did say that he was, because he had been assessed by lots of expert witnesses and stuff. But they said that although he was slightly on the autistic spectrum, it was nothing that would. It wasn't anything that would, you know, contribute to that. It wasn't something that was a massive factor.
Interesting.
Yeah, he was. I mean, he was. Yeah, everybody's probably on the spectrum to some degree or other, aren't they? I don't know, and you know that's why it's a spectrum. But he was. I think there was no indication that he wasn't able to live an ordinary functioning life as an ordinary 15-year-old. You know, and that's in some ways that's what makes this all the more shocking. If there had been a history of the need for interventions and saying I'm hearing voices, I'm being told to do awful things, and what have you. Then, well, maybe the interventions would have stopped it, but there wasn't any of it. It just came out of the blue, you know.
It's mad, isn't it?
It sounds quite similar to some of the cases, I suppose, you hear about mass shooters and people who sit at home in very isolated spaces online. You know, the QAnon movement has a lot of offline harm that's starting to appear in America as well, with that sort of, you know, sitting in corners of the internet, as you said, researching certain things. And I wonder if he'd mentioned to his peers at school that he was interested in serial killers as a subject, if he mentioned that to his parents, and when these crimes happened, if his parents had any kind of inkling or indication that maybe he was involved, because I feel like parental instinct is a real thing. So that would be interesting to know as well.
I don't actually know. I mean, I know I read, as I think Joe has, that he mentioned at school that he wanted to be a serial killer. I kind of assumed that was to his peers. I kind of assumed if you said it to the careers officer, they might tell something. I don't know, but so I assume that's to his friend. But then, you know, how many can you remember? It's a long time ago. I was 15, but mates would say really odd things sometimes about what they wanted to do, you know, or people you knew. So, do you have to take everyone seriously? You know, do we saying there's a duty on kids to report everything their mates say that are far-fetched?
Yeah, that's right. It's funny. I mean, if you think back to when you were at school, there's always somebody at school that you think was a bit odd, or there's somebody that perhaps, you know, is very quiet and stuff like that. I wonder if that was the same for him. I wonder if he was, you know, the quiet kid that was, you know, bullied at school or whatever, and that, you know, that's just come out and people have just gone, oh, whatever, what a stupid thing to say, and not actually thought anything of it. So it's quite interesting to see if that was the case. So so that was the case that we thought we would chat with Colin about today.
Yeah, this one is there's something creepy about this. Like, I can, especially with there not being a motive besides I just want to do this. There's just something about that that just gives me chills. And it's easier to understand if someone like Kacey, you mentioned school shooting, and as we're kind of talking about this, I was thinking about Kip Kinkle, who he was Thurston High School. This is back in the late 90s. He was 15. But the difference with him in his case is he shot his parents and went to school and started shooting up school. Was he was worried because he got suspended, right? And he was like, I embarrassed my family and they won't be able to live their lives now because I'm an embarrassment, so I'm gonna kill him. But like with this one, there's nothing besides I just want to do it.
Yeah.
It's scary that there are people out there that do it for no other reasons than.
I suppose it's like sitting at home as well on your computer on your own, researching all of that stuff, you know, where no one can see you and nobody knows really what thoughts are forming in your mind. There's a kind of darkness around that as well, which I think because we don't understand it, it makes it interesting for us, but also, you know, sinister and scary as well, that people can sit at home and formulate these plans and ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thankfully, it doesn't happen very often, so that's a really good thing.
No, I guess no, it doesn't serial killer, but you know, I guess kids do stupid things. You know, they do stupid things to animals, or they smash up a bus shelter or a phone kiosk, or they do things that they know are wrong because they just want to do them. But thankfully, that's not often a serial murder. But that was what happened here.
Yeah.
Colin, do you think in this day and age it's tougher for serial murders to occur?
Yeah, I think it probably is. I think I talked about this at CrimeCon actually. There was I forget the name of the topic, but it was like something like has DNA put serial killers out of business? And I came back at that with has DNA put detectives out of business? Which is kind of a hobby horse of mine. And I think there's much more there. There's much more in terms of DNA, in terms of scientific advances, CCTV, communications data, automatic number plate, all the things that we know
so much.
that we use. There's so much there. But if you're really putting your mind to it, all those are things that can somehow be circumvented, particularly the DNA. And that was my point, was that if we have a generation, and we're getting very close to that, of having a generation of detectives who have only ever known a world where there was DNA identification, and they are upon it. Certainly in the UK, the Crown Prosecution Service and the courts are so reliant on it. You now get to the stage where if you don't have DNA in a case, like we didn't in Belfield case, because he was clever enough not to leave, the council have to lay out to the jury in terms, in plain speech at the beginning, there is not DNA in this case. And that doesn't mean anything, because they know that everybody sitting on that jury has had a diet of CSI and of Dexter and of all the other things we know about scientific work. And so my fear is, we know that it's possible to do things without leaving DNA if you take the right precautions. If you've got a core of detectives who can only really work if they've got DNA, that's scary. That opens opportunities.
Yeah, very scary. Yeah, it does.
Almost works in favor of those committing the types of crimes where where they don't leave DNA.
And sorry,
go on. Sorry,
it's interesting enough. I won't. One of the things that I've been doing earlier this year was doing some training inputs for a foreign police force, and it's exactly on that basis that the officers that were designing the course, who were British, knew about Belfield, knew about the fact that we didn't have DNA in it, and what they wanted to deliver to this police force was there is still a place for old-fashioned detective work, if you like, pre-DNA stuff of talking to witnesses, taking statements, getting eyewitnesses, piecing together cases and circumstantial evidence. Now, it's a very small foreign police force that have had that foresight, but I think that's how it should be. I think there's a real danger that we put too much reliance on these new techniques and we lose the old ones as an element of de-skilling, and we might be
actual detective work you're losing, isn't it? You're losing the actual detective work.
And that's not to decry the current crop of detectives, because they do what they're forced to do and what's available to them. But I just think it would be a mistake to put all our eggs in the DNA / scientific basket.
Yeah. Morgan, do you remember the case we did of Deborah Lindsley when she was on the train? Do you remember?
Yeah,
and I sent you over the crime scene photos.
Yes.
And this was a lady who was in a single carriage, Kacey, and her body was found. She was killed in this carriage, and there was nothing. Obviously, this was back in the day. It was old style policing, and the crime scene photos have actually got detectives like kneeling in all the evidence, and they've got cigarettes in their mouths, and they haven't got any gloves on. And we were looking back at it and looking at the crime. We were just like, oh my god, there's people like traipsing in and out of the blood in the bottom of the carriage, and we were like, oh my god, look at all the evidence they're walking in. How the hell are they going to ever find anybody? And the CCTV was
aside
so
from
old,
that,
there was nothing.
I mean, the train itself is probably so cross-contaminated across all of the areas as well, that even if the protocol was followed in the way you'd hope it would be today, that even then there's no absolute that you're going to find any linking DNA in that type of case. Public space is really tough like that. I remember saying to my dad, we were watching something years and years ago and I was only young, and I remember saying, why don't they just take the fingerprints off of the telephone? And my dad was like, Kacey, that's a telephone box. There are thousands of fingerprints on the foot. And that was the first time it had occurred to me. So yeah, wow, that's really, really interesting.
The thing is, it's all of its own age, and things move more quickly now, perhaps, accelerated. But, it wasn't that long ago that we were doing forensic retrieval work in murder scenes without hairnets. Without masks. Low copy number DNA, there was never thought to be any problem with that. But because the techniques for retrieving it and for growing it, if you like, and getting a profile became so sensitive, well, we had to react by making sure that we took even more care not to contaminate. So you can look at things like that and think, oh God, that's really. But doubtless there are detectives out there now who would look at me and my team doing something 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and say, gee, did they really do that back in 2004? So it's just progress, isn't it? It's just how it goes on.
That's amazing. You must have seen so much change in procedure and protocol throughout your career in how things are expected to be done. And years ago, where there wasn't really as much DNA to be collected in these cases that could be used in samples, you wouldn't need a hairnet. You wouldn't need to be treating the crime scene in a certain way if you weren't trying to collect, because things couldn't be tested years and years ago. So you must be able to remember points in your career where certain technologies actually came into existence that just didn't exist before in the way that we know them to exist now.
I remember part of my SIO training in the late 90s up in Wakefield in Yorkshire, when I first heard about low copy number DNA, and it was pointed out to us that even something like the mortuary slab, where post-mortems are taken, the need there was going to have to be to clean or not reuse and have disposable instruments and things like that, because the contamination could bleed through from 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 postmortems before. And that just hadn't been a thing, hadn't been a problem. Now it is. And now there are measures taken. It's progress.
Wow.
I'm not
it's
a dinosaur.
Amazing, I'm not a dinosaur. I could talk to you all day about this, Colin. It's brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on. And
when I finish my next bout of filming and stuff, and then perhaps towards the end of the year next year, I'll come back in and we'll talk about something else. I'd love to.
I'd love that. That would be amazing. Thank you. I must tell you, I did have a dream that we did a TV show together. It was called The Podcaster and the Policeman, and we investigated a cold case. And I woke up after and I was like, when you sometimes wake up and go, no, that wasn't true.
It was just going to finish.
And I was like, didn't find out what happened, and woke up and I was just like, and I messaged Morgan, was like, I've just had the best dream. Me and Colin's son had a TV program together. And he's like, you're so crazy.
As I said earlier, don't ever ask yourself how it's going to happen. Just dream it and want it. We get a chance,
but we'll be together in September, won't we?
Yes, we will.
Weeks' time.
Yeah, we will.
Sorry, Morgan, we will miss you.
What's that, Glasgow or?
Yeah. We'll all be together in Glasgow.
So we'll all be there. We can have catch-up drinks and talk more about.
That would be so nice.
Amaretto. You still owe me that amaretto.
I do.
Yeah. The lights went out.
They did, We couldn't get to the bar this time, so I'm definitely.
They made me as a mini bar, and the rest of the night was a blur.
I'm taking Colin to the pub, and I'm gonna give him the Disaronno and Coke. Have you ever had that, Kacey? It's like
that is actually my go-to drink.
Mine too. Yeah. I promised Colin I'm taking him for one of those.
Let me just tell you this very quickly. I did a podcast, not a crime podcast, but a podcast with somebody who just asked me, and it was in Liverpool. It was quite good fun. and he had a thing where he gave each of his guests a rider. So the rider wasn't particularly good. You couldn't sort of order lots of food and clothes and things like that, but you could have whatever you wanted to drink while you were there with him, and he would drink one of the same. So I thought, what's the most horrible thing I've ever had?
God.
And that was there's something in Germany I had, which they called a Dr. Jäger, which is basically Jägermeister with Dr. Pepper.
Ooh.
And it is like drinking
Syrup.
molten plastic, really. You know,
Oh.
it's so synthetic tasting. He actually quite liked it, the guy that I did
Oh
it with.
no,
I did make him do one, and we both sat there and drank one. So yeah, so
that is brilliant.
Cherry, what's the worst thing you can ever drink?
Me, the
Yeah.
worst thing I've ever drank.
Come
I think-
on.
but I don't like whiskey.
No, no.
The worst thing ever was in Vegas. Crime Con Vegas is the worst drink I've ever had. It was a drink. You drink it and then you eat this flour and you chew the flour and
Szechuan
then you
flour.
drink the rest. You drink the rest of the drink and it changes the taste of the drink. Nancy, and us and Mike, there was a few of us that did it. LaDonna, we were all sat there and she said, Nancy was like, "Are you sure about this, Cherry?" And I said, no. Apparently it's amazing. Apparently it's really, really good. So we all got this drink. We all drank it and it was quite nice when we first drank it.
Yeah.
Then I've got video evidence of this. We all started chewing this flour and it was
gross,
like
yeah.
chewing stinging nettles. It like made your mouth go numb. And then when you drink, you know, like if you eat licorice, when you eat something else, it doesn't taste the same. It was like that. When you drink the next part of the drink, it was
Horrible.
awful. It was awful. But I've got a picture of a video of Nancy just like chewing on this flour, still chewing and chewing and chewing this flour for ages. You ask her about that drink when you see her.
Yeah.
You ask her about the flour
And
drink.
didn't we
in
pay like
Vegas.
$25 for those drinks?
Yeah, they were like
each?
$25 each drink. Not worth the $25.
No.
Really not.
Can I ask Morgan a question before we go?
Yeah.
Is that a Middlesbrough scarf behind you?
No, it's Wrexham.
What is Wrexham? Right, okay. I couldn't see. And it looked a bit like a Middlesbrough scarf, but okay, no, that's fine. I've got nothing to say.
Morgan's sister lives in Manchester. Where does she live in Oldham? Is it Oldham your sister lives?
Bolton?
Is it Oldham? Bolton. That was it, Bolton.
Yeah.
And when he came over for Crime Con, he's got to go himself a Wrexham scarf.
Yeah.
Oh, what?
Isn't Wrexham owned by Ryan
It
Reynolds?
is, yeah.
Yeah.
It is.
See,
That's just so bizarre. That's so
I'm a
bizarre.
rugby fan, so I have no idea about all this football
Right, we
business.
could make a good quiz team, I think, actually, Kacey. That was very
Yeah.
good. I'm impressed with that. Only because that question was in a quiz I did recently. We couldn't think of who it was.
Oh, see, you should have had Kacey on the team.
if
Yeah.
we'll get the chance in September, me and Cherry might have to be forced. I mean, we probably would have anyway onto the same table because if there's pizza, I can't have milk and Cherry can't have gluten, so we'll be kind of on the
We're on the weirdo
allergy
table.
That's probably where
But speaking,
Fairweather was at school. No, it wasn't. Anyway.
Probably. He'll be sat
I
on our
gotta go.
table.
Thanks
It's
ever so
nice
much
to
for having
see you.
me.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much for
Colin.
coming on.
Yes,
Thank you very much. We'll see you in
No worries.
September.
Bye, Kacey.
Bye.
Yeah, we can.
Bye.
bye, Colin, bye.
Bye.
Okay, well.
My heart is full.
was
That's
fun.
the best episode we've ever had.
Oh, Cherry, that's so lovely to hear you say
I
that.
absolutely adore that. Was
Oh.
absolutely so much fun. I've really enjoyed having you on and having Colin on. It's been really lovely. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's been great. I think it's good to celebrate milestones and birthdays. The podcasting stuff is tough
Yeah.
sometimes, subject matter aside. So it's nice to be able to have these opportunities to recognize the work that we've done and to get together with friends and just have a nice chit chat. Thank you so much for thinking of me for your 2-year anniversary. I feel absolutely honored to have been asked to come and join you.
Thank you.
Oh, bless you. Thank you so much for being here. See you soon.
Congratulations. Bye
Bye.
bye.
Oh, that was so much fun. I've got a dumb criminal.
Oh, I have
for
one
you.
too. Let's both do them.
We got carried away talking, but I'm going to give you a really fun dumb
Okay,
criminal.
so let's do what we normally do, and let's do a little dumb criminal.
Hey, Captain Stupid Poopy Pants, use a dummy.
Okay. Now, this man has been dubbed South Africa's as dumbest criminal. Okay.
Okay.
Because his name was Thomas. I can't even spell his surname. Ngobo, let's just say. He was 40 years
Okay.
old. Okay. He was on the run for 7 years. Okay. He's wanted for stealing hardware products that were worth more than £1,000. Okay. He was meant to deliver them to his clients and he didn't. He diverted them to another address and stole them all. Okay. Now, he's known as the dumbest criminal because he walked into a police station to check on his application to join the police force.
Oh no.
That made me laugh so much. I was like, what? So he's on the run. He's been on the run for 7 years and he pops into a police station to check on his application to join the force. Because I just thought, what? Oh my God.
Oh.
So that was my dumb criminal for this week. It just made me chuckle and I thought I would bring that one up. I thought it was funny. So
All right.
there
So
you go.
my dumb criminal.
Mhm.
You ready for this? Okay.
Okay.
Now, let's be honest. Carjacking is probably I don't know. Don't carjack people. Okay. But if you're going to carjack people, make sure
Don't do
you
it.
know who you're carjacking before you're carjacking. Okay.
Yeah.
So this was back in March. This was March 19th, 2022. Two officers this was in St. Louis. Two officers had responded to reports of gunfire when a man stepped in front of their car, then walked to the passenger side and pointed the gun at the officers. Now, the
Oh,
man who was
no.
trying to carjack these two officers ran off once he realized that the car was a marked police car.
A marked police car.
So on the side, it says police. So
Bit
he
of a
ran
giveaway.
off, and they ended up arresting a man after a search and found him carrying a gun. Now, no one was injured in the incident. Now, prosecutors decided to refuse to file charges against the man for the attempted carjacking, but they did give him he was charged on first-degree robbery, armed criminal action, and resisting arrest.
Oh my God, what an idiot. I love it. I love our dumb criminals. Great fun. Great
I
fun.
can't.
Well
yeah,
done.
Don't do that.
Don't be dumb, people. Don't be dumb. Well, thank you so much for joining us on our 100th episode. Thank you if you've been with us from the beginning, and thank you if you've just joined us and just found our podcast. We appreciate all the support that we get from you, and we couldn't do it without you guys. All of your reviews that you give us, and they push us up the podcasting charts, and we're really proud of what we've done over the last 2 years. So thank you very, very much for listening. We do appreciate it. And for now, be nice.
And bye.